Well, hello. This is the Atlas Project. My name is Ben Bayer. I am a fellow with the Ayn Rand Institute. This is a weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group about Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged. We are getting very close to being done with the entire novel. Tonight we're going to be discussing Part 3, Chapter 9, which is called The Generator. And before we get started, and before I turn you over to my colleague Greg Salmieri in New York, I do want to make a few important announcements about the project. The first is a reminder about part of our motivation for doing this project, which is to promote the essay contest about Atlas Shrugged that's sponsored by the Ayn Rand Institute. I've put information about the project, about the contest, in the comments section of this post on the Atlas Shrugged Facebook group. You can find out more about how you can win up to $10,000 if you're a student by entering this contest. The deadline is in a little over a month. And so we'll be wrapping this project up soon. That will give you a chance still to enter if you're thinking about it. And I've also put information about recordings of past episodes in the comments section in case you need to catch up and review, especially for the sake of that contest. The other set of announcements that I have concerns the very end of this project. Now, we've made announcements before about how we're planning on having a kind of capstone event for our group, and that's due to happen on Sunday, April 22nd. It's going to run between 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. in Manhattan. We haven't yet identified this precise location or venue, but we've got a couple of options we're working on. We're going to make an official announcement about that probably within the week. But in the meantime, if you go to the Atlas Project Facebook group, which is also linked to in the comment section of this page, you'll see that there's a Facebook RSVP event that's been posted to that group where if you want to come live in person, you can RSVP to come. So especially those of you who are in New York or in the Northeast and are looking to celebrate the end of the project with us, that's an option. If you're thinking about coming to New York from out of town, or out of the region, this would be a good time to do it. It's going to be basically 6 straight hours of informal seminars about the novel as a whole, as opposed to just focusing on an individual chapter as we've been doing. There's a number of collected topics that we've been biding our time waiting to discuss. And we're also going to be looking for your suggestions about what to discuss. You'll see that there's a note, or there will be a note if it hasn't been put there already, on that same event page asking for your suggestions about what to discuss. I think that's everything that I wanted to say. So, Greg, are you ready to take over? And did you want to add anything about this capstone project?
No, I think you covered everything that needs to be covered about it. I'm pleased looking at the monitor now to see that because of the change in the when the sun goes down, you can see the beautiful backdrop we have here, which is mostly looked like nighttime. So we because of various laws whereby the donation of the room shouldn't be thought to count as advertising. I'm not supposed to say who's loaned us this space, but we thank them very much. It's been really wonderful being here, and we'll be here in this office one more time next week, and then we'll have our capstone event.
Roger on that, yes.
Let me just say a little bit about, by way of summary of this chapter, and then what we're going to do, and then we'll get right into the topics for tonight. So this chapter has 3 sequences. Someone's saying the audio is out. Are other people experiencing that? Ben, are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you through the live stream.
Yeah, and all indications are that I'm sending audio. So I'm going to assume, Harry, that the audio is just an issue on your end. If anyone else is having audio issues, let me know. Greg says he could hear us. Good. So the chapter has 3 sequences. The first sequence follows Dr. Stadler as he goes to Project X, planning to take it over. There he encounters a drunken Cuffy Meggs, who has already taken it over. And during the ensuing melee, Meggs strikes at the controls of the device, killing all present and destroying everything within a 100-mile radius, including the Taggart Bridge. Then we get, in sequence 2, we get the long-awaited Dagny going on strike. Although exactly where and why and how that happens within the chapter is something we're going to discuss the details of. It opens on her running to a phone booth with some interesting reflections on her mood while she's running, and I want us to talk about that a little bit later. Then we get the flashback as to how she came to be running at this phone booth immediately after the broadcast that Chapter 8 concluded with, the broadcast of the John Galt planned banquet, right? Galt ends it by saying, "Get the hell out of my way," which line is recalled several times in this chapter. The banquet falls apart. Dagny follows the planners who resolve and overhears their scheme to torture Galt, at which point now she runs off, is running to a phone booth to tell Francisco about it. Francisco tells her to pack up her stuff, and they're going to go. While packing up at her office, she learns of the destruction of the bridge and meets Francisco, says the striker's oath, and now we're into sequence 3, where the scene cuts to Project F, a facility at the State Science Institute named for Ferris, where Ferris, Mouch, and Jim are watching Galt be tortured under Ferris's orders by a functionary mechanic. And it is the torturers rather than Galt who are ultimately broken. So our agenda, we're going to start with Dagny and why she goes on strike. We're going to look at the couple of scenes that are relevant to that. So we're going to start in a way with sequence 2, but focus specifically on Dagny's decision-making. Then we're going to go back to sequence 1 and talk about Stadler. Then we're going to go to sequence 3 and talk about the torture of Galt, and that'll also have us picking up on some of the themes pertaining to Dagny's decision. We'll talk about some other aspects of the first sequence, the decision to torture him, when we talk about that. So, Ben, we had asked online about when Dagny went on strike, and you'd wanted to summarize some of the best of the comments we got on that, or the most interesting and representative ones.
Yeah, there was an interesting little debate that broke out about when precisely Dagny goes on strike, and about 3 different positions were advanced. Schuyler and Greg P. argued that she goes on strike basically when she leaves the room where the looters are talking about torturing Galt, that she's made up her mind by that point. Betsy suggested that it was later when she gets the call from her engineer about the collapse of the Taggart Bridge, and rather than leaping into action as she normally does to try to save the railroad, she, with a great deal of effort, puts down the phone and doesn't make any effort to save it. And then Will and Jesse suggested that it was somewhere in between, before the phone scene, but that the phone scene is still part of what made the decision final for her. David added that there's a couple of other items we want to take account of. Maybe they weren't themselves markers for the actual decision, but they were at least final signs of her having made the decision, and those were the chalking the dollar sign on the statue, and also, of course, taking the oath when she meets Francisco at the very end of the section. I myself would add a couple of data points we should keep in mind about making our minds up about this. One is that when the phone scene is happening, Dagny is described as knowing what Francisco felt like that night many years ago. And we, of course, have been told at another time what was happening in Francisco's mind that night. He told her, I think, when he came to her at Woodstock, that was the night that he decided to give up Danconia Copper. But also, I want to point out, we asked a question in a way. We said, when precisely does Dagny go on strike? And we should at least be wondering about whether or not a decision of that scale is the sort of thing that one would make in an instantaneous moment, as opposed to over time. And Greg, I think you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I purposely used this word precisely to prejudice the discussion in that direction of looking for a moment. And in a way, I think there is one, but decisions are, you can think of it as a process or as gradual. What I think looking at the individual moments does is there are several instances that are flagged as significant. And it's worth thinking about what's going on in each of those. And I think then you can debate about which one counts as the decision to strike exactly. But I think we can identify what is distinctive about each of those moments, and that's what I'd like us to do. Before we go through those moments, I think these are the major ones. When I think the major two are when she overhears what she overhears. There's something that happens then, and then when she is initially moved to do something about the bridge collapsing, but then doesn't, right? And recall that it's this bridge collapsing is the concrete thing that brought her back to the world, right? She was on the fence about it. She was in the valley. They were talking about, Mulligan was telling Galt all the horrible things that are going to happen if you go back to the world, that you're going to be caught up in this catastrophe and that catastrophe, and then the Taggart Bridge will collapse. No, it won't, she says, right? So now the Taggart Bridge has collapsed. This is the concrete horror, right? The thing that was a symbol for her of what she can't let happen, and now it's happened. So those two moments in particular, overhearing the torture, what she realizes, and then what she does in that moment, I think we want to talk about. But first, let's recall what her context is going into this chapter. Maybe she's already decided to strike prior to the chapter. She's already at least made some important decisions. So anyone want to help us review kind of where she is going into the chapter? One part of it I've already said, right, which is that since she's left the valley, Acton identified to her that she has one premise left to check, right? She said, the reason I'm going back is because people can't be blind to us forever. Why can't they be blind to us forever? Well, they still want to live, don't they? And it's so clear what's happening. And he says, do they? That's the one premise you have left to check. So we know for these several chapters, since the end of chapter 2 of part 3, she's been noticing things pertaining to this question of do people want to live. Other things that we've seen over the course of the recent chapters pertaining to her progress towards the decision to strike?
Greg?
Yeah.
I was to add one quick point about the premise checking, and that is that, so even if you identify a point in the current chapter when she not only checks that premise, but let's say rejects it, it's still a premise that we're talking about, a premise in an argument. And moving from a premise to a conclusion in making an argument is itself something that takes time. So she might well reject the premise at a certain point in the chapter, and then over the course of the chapter go through what that implies and come to a certain conclusion on the basis of it. And it would be later then when the conclusion is I should go on strike.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of the beginning of the posterior analytics where Aristotle says, and Carrie Ann's nodding, that sometimes you can get the conclusion simultaneously with the last premise of your argument. And in this case, she knows that if that premise goes, it would lead to the conclusion to go on strike. But still, these things are at least potentially separable mental actions. And so we shouldn't necessarily assume that when she gets the one, it's the same moment as the other. Especially
since the decision in question here is such a big one. I mean, it's got such big stakes for her life. And, people all the time suffer from weakness of will where they have certain premises and don't want to draw the practical syllogism, if we're going to go from Aristotle, to what, the implication for action should be.
Yeah, well, where she was, I think she was teetering. You asked about the context, and then I do think there's a very precise moment that what you alluded to in Aristotle is exactly what happens to her. So I think there is a precise moment, and it's not one that I think was stated yet and among the options people were debating about. So the context going in is she was watching people, watching Galt and the other speakers. And she's like, really? Are they not choosing Galt? Can they see him and not choose him? Can they be indifferent? Like it doesn't matter if they look at Galt or Mouch or anybody? Yeah. So she doesn't quite yet believe it until when she finishes hearing the conversation about them torturing Galt.
Well, let's hold off on that conversation just for a moment.
All right. That's where she's teetering at the end of the last chapter.
But what's interesting to me, so several times over the course of that last chapter, she asks herself rhetorically the question, do they want to live? Right? Even fairly early in it at some points. Yeah. But during the John Galt banquet, right, she's now asking herself that question almost like as a rhetorical question where the answer is no, and she knows it's no. So she's looking at some of the people and saying, do they want to live? The people who see and admire something about Galt but aren't willing to do anything to help him or fight for him. Does someone like that really want to live? What about the people who are indifferent to him and see no difference between him and Mouch? Does someone like that want to live? And what about someone like Jim, who hates Galt when he looks at him? He has what passes for happiness for Jim, or contentment when Mouch is in his field of vision. But when it's Galt, he is hatred and fear. Does someone like that want to live? And her internal voice is contemptuous mockery. So in some sense, she's already come over, though there's a sense in which I think it's right that she definitely hasn't, but there's some sense of her that at some level or in some way, she knows this premise is wrong. Maybe she doesn't see to the bottom of it, but already at the very end of chapter 8. Then there's one other thing that's worth noting. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
I wonder if there's, for her, an important distinction between first deciding that people don't want to live, but then also deciding not only that, but they want him to die. They're not exactly equivalent.
I think that's right, and that's what happened at the crucial scene that Carrie Ann's pushing us towards, and that I want to turn to in a moment. But she gets that there's something wrong with it. It's not true that Jim wants to live, but she still doesn't get what it is that he does want. And I think that's what switch we see in the moment coming, the full reality of it. One other thing to notice about earlier in chapter 8, even before the banquet, there are 2 points at which she does things that are, arguably treason to the railroad, if that were her highest value. First of all, she tells Eddie, Eddie says, you're going to go on strike one of these days, right? And she doesn't say no. And he says, look, I know you can't leave New York now, so I'm going to go to California to do this thing that's important to saving the railroad. And she says, what's the point? Don't go. If she was really on the premise of Taggart Transcontinental as her highest value, or even as Taggart Continental as her highest value, except now that she's in this emergency situation with the love of her life being in prison, so she knows she has to, take some time off from work to deal with it. And in fact, she wouldn't have told Eddie not to go. And second, when she's with Mr. Thompson, and she's faking, to try to save Galt in her talk with Mr. Thompson asks, will he ever give in? And there's like a needle in her mind that's indicating what course of action to go, like a compass needle. And it wavers between telling him no, in which case maybe he'll hold on to power for too long, trying to wait for, if she told him no, if she told him yes, maybe he would hold out and try to hold on for power too long, and Taggart Transcontinental would be destroyed. But if she told him the other thing, he would give up quicker, but kill Galt first. And so she, at that point, one decision would be the thing that said, I'm willing to sacrifice Galt to keep TT, Taggart Transcontinental. The other is, I'm not willing to sacrifice Galt to do it, even at the risk of losing Taggart Transcontinental. And she chooses Galt over the railroad. So already, these are things that I think indicate that there's Galt's highest value, not Taggart Transcontinental, even though she's not ready to go on strike yet. And Galt says, and she goes and finds Galt, and he says, I can tell you're not ready to go on strike yet. All right, so there's something she's still not ready for. There's something she still doesn't understand, even though she understands in some sense that her previous view that the looters want to live or value their lives is at least likely not true. She's already kind of mocking herself in a way for holding it of people like Jim. So what happens in this conversation? They decide to torture Galt, and what is it in particular about it that is so monumental to Daphne? Carrie Ann, do you want to read the line? I know you had it on tap a moment ago.
Well, what happens, and then the line that I think is really crucial for pinpointing the precise moment, is when Lawson has a mirthful grin, he can't wait to get to the torture machine. So,
or to get to the radio and for let Farrah get to the torture machine.
Exactly. Yeah. So she said she knew They did not, and I'm going to skip down to the bottom of the they did not want to live. They wanted him to die. The horror she felt was only a brief stab, like the wrench of a switching perspective. She grasped at the objects she had thought to be human were not. She was left with a sense of clarity, of a final answer, and of the need to act. That, I think, is the precise she gets. Not only that they don't want to live, they want him to die, and it's going to entail them dying too. And that's when she switches the perspective from, now I got it, and the very moment she gets the last premise, she knows she has to act. And that's what I think propels her forward.
Yeah, this is also what I see as the moment of her going on strike. And I don't think it's just Lawson's grin alone. It's the reaction of all of these people, Ferris, Mouch, Thompson, Jim, I think is an important part of it, and Lawson. And I'll read a little bit more of that passage. Let me just actually read out the whole paragraph, because it's a significant paragraph. And this is on page 1135 of what we're calling the Standard Edition. She knew what they intended doing and what it was within them that made it possible. They did not think that this would succeed. They did not think Galt would give in. They did not want him to give in. They did not think that anything could save them now. They did not want to be saved. Moved by the panic of their nameless emotions, they had fought against reality all their lives, and now they had reached a moment when at last they felt at home. They did not have to know why they felt it, they who had chosen never to know what they felt. They merely experienced a sense of recognition. Since this was what they had been seeking, this was the kind of reality that had been implied in all of their feelings, their actions, their desires, their choices, their dreams. This was the nature and the method of the rebellion against existence and of the undefined quest for an unnamed nirvana. They did not want to live, they wanted him to die. The horror she felt was only a brief stab, like the wrench of a switching perspective. She grasped at the objects she had thought to be human were not. She was left with the sense of clarity and of the final answer and of the need to act. He was in danger. There was no time and no room in her consciousness to waste emotion on the actions of the subhuman. Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say that I think that reference to this state as a kind of unnamed nirvana is really interesting. One reason is that, I mean, all throughout the book, there have been all kinds of negative references to Hinduism and Buddhism and the views of life that they represent. But also there's the point that, I mean, nirvana is usually associated with a kind of state of peace, which isn't supposed to have a negative connotation. But here what's being named is, I mean, maybe it's the peace of the grave, but it's definitely with a much more negative connotation than usually associated.
Well, in general, Galt has this idea, and I think Rand has this idea, that a lot of ideals are particularly religious ideals, but also some of the Marxist ideals, don't have any positive content. They're nice ways of saying something that amounts to death or destruction or the antithesis of reality. And I think we should talk more about this when we get to the passage on Jim Taggart at the end of the chapter, where he comes to this realization as well. Both Taggart siblings realize what moves people like Jim Taggart in this chapter. But one thing a little bit broader than the nirvana point that I want to make here is that he's it's part of it is that they don't want to live. Part of it is that what they want is not to live but for Galt to die as opposed to their living. But part of it is she's had kind of two related things she was confused about. What motivates these people, and how do their minds work? How is it that they don't see things that you gotta see? It's just too obvious not to see it, and they don't. How is it that they can think something works, or pretend to think it works, or want her to pretend that it will work when it won't, when it's just clear as day that it can't? How is it that they're able to manage not to be rational? What's going on in their minds, and how does that tie to their motivation? And you could see that what she's getting here is something an understanding of their whole mode of consciousness, which we saw her coming towards in the previous chapter. And it's the kind of thing that the point that Galt has made about the mystics. And I think we should talk more about this point when we get to Jim Taggart towards the end of it, about just what is it about the enemies that that Rand thinks and that Galt has identified in the novel and that Daphne comes to realize now. But it's one way of putting it is that they don't want to live. Another way of putting it is that not only don't they want to live, at least the worst of them want him to die, and indeed maybe want themselves to die. And a third way is that there's something about they're in rebellion against existence, or they want some kind of nirvana, but whatever their goal is, heaven, nirvana, whatever they call it, it's not a real goal, but an excuse for the destruction of actual values. And those are the elements of what she's grasping. More on that later, but let's focus on now that she's had this real shift in perspective where she doesn't see these people as human anymore. And therefore doesn't see them as such that they'll eventually come around, or they can only go so bad. This was the same realization that Reardon had about his family, right? It didn't lead Reardon immediately to go on strike. He had other realizations to make about his own responsibility. But we've been thinking this will be Daphne's last realization. And I think from this moment in the novel on, she fully has the strikers' philosophy in the same form that they hold it. And she recognizes the need to go on strike as the result of it. And she basically is on strike. And here's some evidence for that. One, if you look at her mood as she's running from the Wayne Falkland Hotel, the thing that's described when we first see her, there was a sense of weightless freedom. This is, I'm quoting some lines from, I don't have the page, I think it's 1133 maybe, anyway, a page or two before what I just quoted. There's a sense of weightless freedom. She feels for the first time that she owned the city and that she loved it. She had never loved it before as she did in this moment. There's a sense of detachment and deliverance, and she's past any fear she had known in the past. She could say, "Get the hell out of my way" to it. Let me put the lovely city behind me while we talk about this. So I think this mood is the kind of striker's mood, striker's perspective that we're seeing. She loves the things that she had loved before more than she loved them before, because now she sees what the things that had been barriers or that had been contradictions or that had led her to not fully be able to enjoy them are now struck, they're gone. And she could look at them totally from the context of her values. And then there's some more concrete evidence that she's now joined the strike and is seeing herself as part of the strike. And that's how she packs. I mean, Francisco says there's not going to be time to go back. He tells her what to pack. He's telling her things that are on the premise of her striking. And I mean, look at what she packs. And you had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, so she's, first of all, she's not just packing, but she's changing her clothes. Not just from evening clothes into rescue clothes, but specifically into the very white sweater that Galt asked her to wear the next time that he saw her. And I mean, you could say, well, she's going to see him. She knows she's going to see him again because she's going to at least try to rescue him. But I mean, one doesn't think about fashion choices typically when one's just trying to rescue somebody. One only makes those kinds of choices when there's an envisioned reunion. On top of that, she's bringing the jewelry that Francisco asked her to bring, presumably because that's the only thing that she can bring with her that would be valuable in the valley, and along with the gold piece. And she thinks she's never going to be in her apartment again. So why would she be thinking that if not because she was going to be gone for good?
Yeah, and if you think about what she's thinking as she's doing this. Right. So let me just read it. It was easy to leave the apartment and lock the door, even though she knew she would probably never open it again. Why is she thinking that it's easy if she's not? If it's the point isn't I'm leaving this, right? It's not like I know how to operate the key. The point is I thought it would be hard to leave this, but it's not. It was easy. It seemed harder for a moment when she came to her office. she stood looking for a moment. Then she smiled, skipping a little bit. No, it was not too hard, she thought. She opened her safe and took the document she had come here to get. So she had this idea that it's really hard to go on strike. There's some difficulty. There's this sense of whether it's hard or easy to leave these things behind isn't relevant unless she's doing what she's doing on the premise that she's leaving them behind. But now here, I think, is why the other theme that people brought up as the other possible moment of her going on strike is really relevant, because it's at this point when she's thinking, it was easy to leave my home. It's not too hard, she smiled, to leave the office. This is nothing, That then the person comes in. Oh, my God, Miss Taggart, you're here, and tells her about the Taggart Bridge escaping. And she seizes the phone kind of automatically, as Francisco automatically ran to help at the furnace breakout at Reardon Steel, and as she automatically ran back at the news of the Winston Tunnel disaster. Her first impulse is to act, right? And what she can't bear is that someone will just stand by and let these disasters happen and not do anything about it. And then, right, it's very hard for her to put down this phone, for her not to take action. And it's in that moment that she knows what it was like for Francisco in that moment, on that night with her 12 years ago, and what it was like when a boy of 26 looked at his motor for the first time. So I think it's at this moment that what's happening, well, she's having to take the first action that's difficult for her as a result of her commitment to leave the world, or to leave this world anyway, which isn't really the world as she now sees. And the first action she took were artificially easy. They were, packing up her house while she was in a rush to save her lover. But now's the first one that's a hard action, and now it's not, this isn't a piece of cake, Here's the thing that she's, in effect, paying the price at this moment. The price that Galt had to pay when he gave up his motor, the price that Francisco had to pay when he gave up her. The decision maybe already have been reached, but, it was a little bit on credit until this moment, and here's where she had to pay for it. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, and remember that with respect to Francisco, which she's thinking of in this moment, I mean, presumably Francisco had also made the decision to quit well before spending the evening with Dagny, and so his spending it with her, that puts him in the face of a temptation, just like she's dealing with now. He knows that he's going to have to give her up, and he does.
Well, it's a little bit harder there because Galt told him to, take some time and think about it, think about all the effects on your life, and then it's the next morning that he tells Galt. Now you could say, well, she hasn't taken the striker's oath yet, and that's true. But I think Francisco had reached the decision already, in a way that... And
he even says,
or hadn't
even though he's
decision,
right.
Sorry. Yeah.
Right? Even though Galt is right. So he's already, at least intellectually, convinced that he should go on strike. Mm-hmm. It's just a question of combating the weakness of the will again, to use it.
That might be right. Other thoughts on these issues from New York? Yeah, Robert?
Well, Francisco also had a telephone hesitation move as well in the Wayne Falkland Hotel. So he had already been on strike for 12 years, so that natural reaction to act is something that the strikers have until they see the full context of what their goal is, and then they
really excellent point, Robert. So I think it's not the case that the fact that she finds this difficult and that her first impulse is to act, that does not show that she's not yet on strike, because even the strikers have that. But this moment is significant in her life in a way that the Reardon one isn't as significant, because this is her first one of that. Her first couple of actions as a striker were artificially easy for her. And this is the first hard one. And that's how I see it anyway. Any other thoughts on this or alternative interpretations? All right, so what about...
I think Robert's point is...
The other point is, thematically, conflict is a major part of the struggle that each of the strikers has, so it's not even only only the ones we see, it's even the ones we don't see, who go through this process.
Who had to wrote down on Galt's wall and so forth.
Right.
The first night is the hardest.
And the lightness she felt while walking through the city is exactly what Ken Daniger in his office, let's go to New York, let's see one more look around the city. So that peace, they're at peace when they make that decision.
I think that's right. And also, even after that peace, all of them still have some difficulty because the people who write those things on the wall in Galt's guest room are people who've already gone on strike and gone to the valley, but the first night is hard. Ben, you were going to say something about Robert's, what Robert.
Yeah, I was just going to add about his earlier point about how even the strikers face these kinds of temptations. I think it's a really good point because, part of what it means here to shift whole perspective, as Dagny is doing, is that your earlier perspective, it wasn't just a single view, it was a whole perspective. It was a whole, way of approaching life with a whole set of automatized thinking and behavior patterns. And, part of what complicates the question of when does she make the decision is that even, and this connects to my earlier point about what it means to check a premise and then draw a conclusion, is that even, it takes some time to see what the implication of that premise is for this whole set of different behavior patterns and habituated actions. And even if you understand the fundamental, it takes a while not only to see the consequences, but then implement them, especially when you've habituated a different set of integrated points.
Yeah, there's another interesting question here about what it really is to hold the premise. And I think if you look at that passage about what Dagny realizes is going on in the mind of the ruling clique when they decide to torture Galt, you get some interesting kind of insights into Rand's view of what it is to hold the premise. But let's come back to that when we talk about Jim towards the end. Ben, Harry's asking if you're saying Dagny's battling weakness of the will. Do you want to comment on that and then maybe tell people what that term means if they're not familiar with it?
Yeah, I tried to get a word in that I was using a philosopher's term of art, which is there's a old problem in philosophy that philosophers call the problem of weakness of the will. In Greek, it's akrasia, I think. And it's just the question of whether knowing what is good automatically motivates you to act on the good. And there seem to be a lot of kinds of cases where people know that know what it is to do the right thing, but act against it. And if that's a real problem, then this would be another one of those cases. Now, whether it's an unresolvable problem is a complicated question we can't probably answer totally here, but
what's always made it an issue in the history of philosophy is the question of the way it's come up is, can you act against your knowledge of what's good? And there are all sorts of cases of people who clearly in some sense can be said to know that a certain action is wrong or a certain other action is good. They tell you it's bad or it's good. They feel regret after they take the wrong action. And in some sense they know that this is bad, and yet they do it anyway. And you can include bad for them, and how is it that that's possible? And this is a problem, especially for the Platonic, Socratic, Aristotelian tradition and thought. This is where this arises. And what you get in earlier Plato and in Aristotle, and maybe in all of Plato, depending on how you interpret him, is the idea that there's a way in which they know, but there's another way in which they don't know. Their knowledge isn't fully activated in the moment, or something's blocking it, or somehow the knowledge is being made not to come to bear in the moment. And it's interesting to think about where Rand stands on that. She talks about Reardon, the difference between honest errors and moral breaches. Reardon won't forgive a single moment of conscious evil. So in some sense, Rand thinks there is conscious evil, or Reardon, her heroes do. And yet, what seems to be going on with the villains and what Dagny's learning is that they have some thing they do with their consciousness that stops their knowledge from being real to them. So it sounds like the kind of Aristotelian view where your knowledge doesn't get activated or doesn't get brought to bear, but it's not. Aristotle's view is there's a condition you can be in where that just happens to you. And it seems like Rand's view is that the villains are culpably making that happen to themselves, but there also seem to be cases where it can happen to you by default unless you effortfully summon or make that knowledge active. And maybe that's what's happening to Dagny here. She has to work to bring up her knowledge and her relevance to it.
The temptation that one often has when looking at Rand's view of free will as the choice to think or not to think is to say, well, the problem of weakness of the will is the easy one to resolve because all you have to do is choose to focus. And once you choose to focus, you activate that knowledge of the good and action kind of follows automatically. At least I've entertained that solution to the problem in the past. But I do think that, especially when you look at scenes like this with Dagny, it's probably an oversimplified solution. There's not enough for her to know that she should go on strike when she's automatized all of these other reactions. There's something more. And we've had debates back and forth about this with other objectivist philosophers, but it might be that what that more is itself a special form of activating additional knowledge, but it might just be an oomph that she has to exert at a certain point.
Jane, did you want to come in on this? Or
Just a little bit. Well, one, I don't want to get bogged down in that debate, the historical debate about autocracy too much. I think a lot of people think it's a problem because they mistranslate what autocracy is. They say weakness of will, but that assumes a certain kind of moral psychology.
I mean, it's
and
just
that
weakness.
So it's that there's a weakness of the will, and that's not, in the Greek, that's not what the term means. It's like lack of authoritativeness of what? Of reason. And at least in Aristotle, as in Rand, Aristotle talks about people choosing not to pay attention. He faults them for not knowing the universals about what the nature of good and bad, and that it's your responsibility for attending to this. He uses the verb of paying attention. And so I think that that's somewhat akin to when Rand discusses you're evading, you're refusing to look, you're choosing not to look. What's not authoritative is you're not using your rational faculty, which is the best of you. You're going by what you feel, etc. So I think that there's the responsibility for not seeing, not using your reason is on the onus of the individual, and that's why you're not in touch with knowledge, the knowledge of what is really good. And it's not that that's it automatically comes, it takes a lot of work, but you have to choose to go on that trajectory.
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions. Let's not make this an Aristotle thing, but there are a couple of questions to think about here, and they're both more general than Aristotle. You can think about them. There's one, are you responsible for the general kind of state of character you have now because of what you've done in the past? Aristotle definitely thinks that. There's another question, if somebody has this condition of akrasia, and I too don't like to translate it weakness of will for the same reason you don't. It's lack of strength is literal, or incontinence, some people translate it, but that sounds like you have a medical issue. There's a question of whether in the moment the acratic person could do better and isn't. And I mean, I interpret that he thinks that there's something wrong with their automated perceptual reactions such that the saliences of them are so off that it's hard or maybe even impossible in some cases for them to make the right choice in the moment. But it's at least harder. It's not. But anyway, but some of these are anyway questions for Aristotle scholarship. Maybe you and I should have a talk, even a podcast or something, sometime talking about Aristotle. But this is the kind of issue, though, that is relevant in this moment. Yeah. She knows something. It can be sometimes hard to act on your knowledge. And we see in Atlas cases of that for all of the heroes, including even Galt, who has the least of this. He, too, has to effortfully resummon the context in the moment when he sees Reardon, when he decides not to go into her room and so forth. Okay, so let's turn to just the other moments that were brought up, Ben, in connection with Dagny's decision to go on strike, and that's her chalking the dollar sign, or her lipsticking, I guess, the dollar sign symbol on Nat Staggered.
It's a nice literary touch, I've always thought.
statue and her taking the oath. And does anyone have anything they want to say about either of these two moments and their relevance here? I mean, I see them as basically ceremonial. It's like, you know, when you put the ring on during a wedding ceremony and you exchange the rings, it's not, you know, is that when you're making the commitment? Well, it's something you're doing in token of the commitment, not, and I see these both as that. Well, I felt the need to mind that. But anyway, so.
Which isn't to downplay them at all, right? Because, I mean, symbolism is important for Dagny, and the statue of Nat Taggart has been a constant presence in her mind through the book and source of inspiration, and you know, to the point of being almost kind of like a religious inspiration. And a lot of the language that she's, you know, that describes her sense of weightless freedom and deliverance, you know, it's like deliverance from sin. It's like deliverance from evil, and so the symbolism is not incidental here.
And Galt himself said, you know, chalk a $sign on the base of Nat Taggart's statue where it belongs. So, you know, he wanted Nat to be involved in this exchange. Muhammad, yeah.
It's a very, like, symbol-heavy chapter, and I think the lipstick being used to the $sign is, reminds me of how Galt thinks of Dagny as a, what was it? It was luxury and an appreciation, like, for its source.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
Being
Absolutely.
used to do it as a I think has to do with that. Like, I get the feeling that it has to do with that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Ben, you were saying yes to that. I just repeat that.
I agree completely. Yeah, I mean, they could have used, I just said absolutely. It could easily have been that she found some chalk, but I mean, the author made an intentional choice here, what she was going to use. Your mic is off.
Nice bit of symbolism and one I hadn't thought of in that connection. All right, so let's move on back to the first sequence in the chapter, the Robert Stadler sequence. And this is our, well, I guess it's no spoiler to say it's our last time seeing Stadler in the novel since he dies in the scene. So this is our last time seeing Stadler. And he meets a terrible end. So I thought it might be nice, and we have room to do it since it's a pretty short chapter, to kind of review how Stadler got to this point. And Ben, you put together a kind of, you know, summary of Stadler's life, yeah, but the lives and times of Robert Stadler. So do you want to take us through some of that?
Yeah, and such a life it is. 27, he writes a revolutionary treatise on cosmic rays. 32, becomes head of physics at Patrick Henry University. At 40, endorses the establishment of the State Science Institute. I figured out that that was about 13 years before the beginning of the novel. And then we meet him for the first time in the course of the regular action of the novel. It's winter. The statement by the State Science Institute against Reardon Metal has just been released. Dagny and Eddie are devastated by it because they had always regarded him as a kind of hero of the intellect. So she goes to visit him. That's where we find for the first time more about his attitude, about how, you know, what can you do when you deal with people, that is, and, you know, you can't use reason with them. And he's got this elevation of theory over practice. You see that when dealing with people, but also questions of technology, applied technology, he sees as inferior to theoretical science. We also find out about how somebody, the second assistant bookkeeper, who we of course later find out was Galt, had damned him for having endorsed the State Science Institute, and that this has affected him significantly. We'll come back to that, but you wanted to take a break at that point.
Well, just there are a few thoughts I wanted to add here, and maybe some of the New Yorkers also will. One is recall what's written on the State Science Institute in dedication to Stadler, which is played up in this, to the fearless mind, to the inviolate truth.
Inviolate and fearless. This is the mind was praised, basically. So.
Yeah, but I think am I right that it's to the fearless mind, to the inviolate truth? Does anyone have it?
And also his remark that free scientific inquiry is a redundancy.
Yeah, free scientific inquiry is an redundancy. But what I find interesting about the fearless mind and the inviolate truth keep that in mind. Also, when we're going through a when we go through a progression like this, right, we're seeing what a character did at different times. The one thing we also want to really attend to is what choices is he making. So one major choice point was the choice to endorse the State Science Institute when he did. And we know that what happened there is that this student, this second assistant bookkeeper, damned him. That's Galt. And we now know also, right, that he had this argument. He sees Axton in the hall and he yells at Axton, "Damn you idealists," at this moment. And Axton thought he had heard a man, utter his epitaph, or I forget exactly how Axton put it. Then the other choice that he makes in this chapter, now when Dagny sees him in the present is, and this is relevant to what Harry's asking online now, I see, is Dagny comes to him, she shows him the statement. He is disgusted by the statement the State Science Institute issued. He agrees with her that these are not words that a scientist can speak. He knows that they're doing it for the reason of excusing the failures of the metallurgical thank you, department of the State Science Institute, and yet he's not willing to state the truth. He who's in the inviolate truth and the fearless mind, he's afraid to say what's true, and he's making a choice here. He could say, you're right, I don't know what the constitutes to the Institute will be, but I've got to tell the truth here. Maybe I even will try to defend the Institute, but I'm not going to let it lie. And Reardon, this is what Reardon really damns him for, right? Reardon says later to Dagny, he wanted you to help him fake that he didn't try to destroy your railroad and my metal. And so this is an important choice point for Stadler. And it's the first choice we see him make in the action of the novel. We're told about this earlier one. And of course, he goes downhill from there. Anything New Yorkers want to add on this early Stadler stuff?
Oh.
Yeah, Carrie Ann, and then Mohammed?
There was the book that Ferris published.
Well, that's the next bit, so let
all right.
Ben
I
get
couldn't
to
remember
that.
sequentially.
Mohammed, anything else from this early?
Only that, a lot of times when we discuss, villains, we just, assume villainy from the beginning, whereas it's clear Stadler began the novel on not such a good footing, but it still was a long way down to where he eventually ended up. So I just want to, at each stage that you described, just kind of think of him in moral terms. So at what point is he becoming really, really, really bad? What's the scale on that? Mm-hmm. And you just want to see that progression, because we just think of Stadler as just a bad guy, not someone who's bad but becoming way worse in all these different ways.
But he's presented in a much more sympathetic way early in the novel.
Yeah,
Galt has already damned him, and what Dagny thinks about it is an interesting question back then, and she's certainly horrified by what he does in that scene, but she thinks he's good enough that she goes to him to try to get him to.
Yeah.
Anyway, Ben, you want to carry on?
Yeah, so there's going to be another choice point in this next sequence of events. So we get to the winter of the second year, and this is after Wyatt has quit, of course, and so there's an energy shortage, and he's having to deal with that. He's learning about Project X for the first time. And then in the spring that follows, he's ruminating on how he feels starved for intelligence. He might have gotten it from some European novelist who was interviewing him for a while, but then is disappointed by them. It's at this point that he then confronts Ferris about this "Why Do You Think You Think" book and about Project X. And notably, he doesn't condemn the "Why Do You Think You Think" book either, in a similar turn of events to his not condemning the statement about Reardon Metal. He feels embarrassed for having betrayed men of intelligence in having done this, and tries to, he thinks of a face, a young face that he's tried to forget, hopes this face hasn't read the book, hopes that he's dead. And of course, it's Galt that he's thinking about. And in the same sequence, or shortly after the same sequence, this is where Dagny meets with him one more time to ask if he could have known who might have invented the motor that she's searching for the inventor for. He thinks no one on Earth could have invented it. He's astounded that somebody would have undertaken a theoretical revolution just for the sake of a practical application, and perhaps not accidentally reveals that he once knew someone named John Galt who he think has to be dead, just like he was thinking just like he was hoping that face he's thinking about earlier in the chapter had to be dead, and hoping that he hadn't read Why Do You Think You Think?
And it's this face that he wants to see more than anything in the world, and has to hope he's dead, right? And I don't have a better word. Use the word embarrassment is what he feels it, and that feels like too meager a word, although it's hard to come up with another one, right? But it's
shame.
He feels like shame, I think, is better. Yeah, he feels like he's betrayed, and knows that he's betrayed the fearless mind, the inviolate truth, and what he wants more than anything else is some shred of intelligence in his life, and yet what he's doing is failing to dissociate himself from the damning and demeaning of intelligence, which is what this book is, which he knows is disgusting and despicable, is willing to say it to Ferris, but he's afraid now, and it's fear that's driving him, that he won't denounce it, and he feels shame, and he doesn't think anyone he ever values will want to talk to him again. Which is why he's so eager, right? When Dagny calls him, oh, yes, I can be there today. I was going to be in New York anyway. And why he's so needy of her in that moment. And yet, on the positive side of him, right, his reaction to seeing the motor is a kind of awe and reverence. It makes Dagny wish it was possible for her to like him. He does, in the end, tell her about Quentin Daniels, right?
It is to see an achievement that's not his.
How great it is to see an achievement that's not my own, yeah.
Which is actually such a good line that I forgot it was said by a person that eventually ended up being mad.
Yeah.
Like when I first read I thought it was I remember that line, but I forgot it was said by someone that is actually a villain.
And it's a line Rand repeats in her own voice in her introduction to Leonard Peikoff's The Ominous Parallels. So there's a really big endorsement of The Ominous Parallels for those of you who haven't read it, which is a fantastic book. But just the fact, putting aside what book she's endorsing, the fact that she would, echo that sentiment in her own voice, and consciously do so. Go ahead, Ben.
To this question of whether, of how much she was able to evince admiration for Stadler. I mean, it's important probably that, one of the models, I wouldn't say inspiration, but I mean, she herself, Rand interviewed Robert Oppenheimer when she was working on writing a script about the building of the atomic bomb. I sometimes wonder if the European novelist who's supposed to have come and visited Stadler, that there was something about that exchange. She admired Oppenheimer. She agreed with the project that he was undertaking. Though I think she also disagreed with certain aspects of his philosophy. So it's possible to isolate one aspect of the person's character and then abstract from that in one direction or another for literary purposes.
Oppenheimer's wife was a communist also, or Rand thought she was. And in the biographical interviews, she talks about that she thought she was like feeling her out in the way that, she was some kind of leftist. I don't know independently of Rand saying this in the interview whether she was a communist or not. But Rand seemed to think that not only was she a communist, but she was like, KGB connected and maybe a spy or something. I have no idea if that's true about her. But the point is there was lots in Oppenheimer's life that she would have objected to, given that he was married to this woman she thought so ill of.
Okay, so I will move to the next sequence. In retrospective, we get to the summer of the third year. This is, of course, when Project X is finally unveiled, and we get to another choice point where he can either endorse Project X or, tell the people, how terrible it is, like that journalist wants him to, and he endorses it. And this is where we saw what we were calling his spiritual death at that time. And Greg, as you pointed out, it's only after this part that he starts to publicly spout the kind of propaganda that's associated with Ferris's book. he at one point a statement is released: an enlightened citizenry should abandon superstitious worship of logic and outmoded reliance on reason, just as laymen leave medicine to doctors and electronics to engineers. So people who are not qualified to think should leave all thinking to the experts and have faith in experts' higher authority. And right after that, you get quoted lines from a minister or preacher who's spouting parallel religious propaganda. Then we get to winter of the fourth year, and it's the final year, of course. And the next time we see him is right before Galt's speech, and Dagny sees him assembling, for the speech that Thompson's about to give, and she observes the change in him since the last time she saw him. That look of timeless energy of boyish eagerness is gone. Nothing remained to the face except lines of contemptuous bitterness. And of course, it's here where when they find out that the broadcast has been interrupted, that he says that's not possible. No one on Earth could possibly do that, just like nobody on Earth could have built the motor. And then, of course, when Galt gives his speech, Galt singles him out as the damned and the guiltiest among you. His audience are the men who had the capacity to know yet chose to blank out reality, the men who were willing to sell their intelligence into cynical servitude to force, the contemptible breed of those mystics of science who Stadler says must be killed. And it's worth pointing out that later in this chapter, when he's going up against Cuffy Miggs, there's a brief moment where Stadler almost says, "You're not the reason why I sold ... And of course, I think that what's the thought that's coming through his mind is that he himself sold his intelligence into cynical servitude to force, and he's seeing now what he's getting. Then finally, Stadler's made to interview Galt. He breaks down in front of him with all of the series of "I couldn't help it's." Galt doesn't say anything to him, and we get then finally to the escape to Iowa, where he's going to show Galt and maybe the other gangsters in Washington how to be practical, and we get his physical death at the hands of his spiritual son, as he's described, this Cuffy Meggs character.
Yeah, I think we see really 4 choice points for Stadler, right? There's the initial choice point of founding the State Science Institute. That's enough for Galt to damn him. And witnessing his reaction to that is enough for Axton to think this guy's, destroyed himself. And Axton and Galt regard him as really, really bad from the beginning. Galt calls him my worst enemy save one. This is before even the Project X. Anyone knows about Project X? Sorry, he calls Dagny my worst enemy save one. Stadler is the one who's the worst, but he's the one who's the conscious enemy, and he doesn't think will be redeemed. And Axton says if there was anyone to kill to save his 3 students, Stadler was the man to kill. Though killing, of course, wasn't the solution. So the strikers think he's really bad really early, and that's from this first choice, right? The second choice we see in the novel is the choice not to defend Rearden Meadow from Ferris. The third is the choice not to disavow what makes you think you think, or why do you think you think. And then finally, this choice of giving the speech, not disavowing Project X. And then there are other choices, but those are, I think, the big ones that set his direction. Robert?
Yeah, I was going to say, what wasn't mentioned was when Axton does the flashback with the 3 students, he says Stadler never understood the importance of philosophy. Mm-hmm. And he called them impractical, I'm sick of you impractical idealists. So yeah. That is his downfall, not understanding the importance of philosophy.
And yet, Rearden didn't understand the importance of philosophy either. And Rearden says, if some man such as you, Axton, had told me that by accepting the looter's view of sex, I was falling into their economics, I would have laughed in his face. But, so it's not just that he had this mistake about philosophy, but also what he did when confronted with evidence of that mistake. JG in our Facebook group has been really going on about the point. I think he's somewhat overplaying it, but I think there's a very important point here. He's been saying, the only sins or the only real moral issue is what you do when you realize you've been wrong, or when you're confronted with evidence that you've been wrong. And I don't think that's the only time in life when when things come up, when there are moral choices. But merely being mistaken about something is not a moral failing, at least according to Rand and to Galt. But when you're mistaken, that's an occasion. If you're living by a mistaken belief, at various points in your life, evidence is going to come up of the mistake. You're going to run into contradictions. You're going to need to check your premises. And what you do in those moments, whether you check them or not, whether you evade, whether you try your best to get to the truth, whether you have a fearless mind that's in search of inviolate truth, or whether you're a frightened mind that doesn't care that much about the truth and is willing to violate it, to not face things, to keep things as though the world would cease to be if only you cease to look at it. That's, I think, the moments where your moral character is really revealed. Mohammed?
If we're talking about Robert's...
This Robert or Robert Stadler?
Stadler.
Okay.
Oh, I did not notice. Okay. No, but if we're talking about his fear, so his fear was that if he were to contradict his scientists, that would, be the end of the institute. So what exactly was his, or fear that he would have to say to himself, oh, well, look, I kind of built this and now it's off. Is that the fear that he has?
Well, I think it depends on at which moment we're talking about in the story.
How about the metallurgy report that he thought was like BS?
So, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I was going to say the whole State Science Institute depends on funding, and what Stadler realizes is that Ferris is the one behind the funding. So if he doesn't do what Ferris wants, Ferris is going to take away the funding.
Okay, so it's the fear.
I think it's even deeper than that, though, because he's afraid of competing in the marketplace to get private funding for it. He's like, these people in the world, they're too stupid to realize the importance of science, and I want my scientific research guaranteed. He's afraid to competitively get it or live without pursuing it if not enough people can be persuaded that they should choose to support him. So I think he's ultimately afraid of competing in the market in some sense.
Al?
I'm just wondering if there's a premise in Ayn Rand's description of Stadler that being irredeemably evil is not merely a matter of what you do, but also how you use your mind or refuse to use your mind.
Well, I think any being evil for her is a matter of how you use your mind. Not only that, but what everything you do comes from how you use your mind in her view. And so even being a little bit evil or a little bit good or a lot good is a matter of that.
But coming to the point where an objective observer would say, this person, there is no reasonable possibility that this person will redeem themselves, improve themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Alex, you wanted to come in on that?
Yes, I wanted to comment that the ultimate source of Stadler's problems is that he doesn't have any self-esteem. He doesn't believe that he's redeemable, and he's afraid of facing Galt and facing him after all of these years because he's ashamed of what he's done. He's not proud of himself. He feels like he cannot compete in the marketplace because he doesn't think he can succeed. On one hand, he seems to have an overinflated ego in that, I'm smarter than everyone and no one's more worthy than me, but he's using that to mask how he really feels about himself.
Yeah, we could see that. He's not the only character where we could see that. What I think sad in his case, though, so there are people who are always like that, who never had any self-esteem, and who are touchy, vain people who are always masking it. In Stadler's case, I think we're meant to think of him as someone who did have a real earned self-esteem with chinks in it. And at moments where he could have done what's emotionally difficult, but what amounts to holding the truth as inviolate, he didn't. And so he was eroding his self-esteem. And what was left was this, don't you know who I am? I'm Robert Stadler, thing instead of self-esteem, this touchy vanity. Let's move on, and we'll have occasion to talk more about him, but let's go through what happens with him in this chapter. And So we've already got, he's now where Ben left us with him. He's headed to Iowa. His plan is to take over Project X. He thinks he can do it just by puffing and saying he's Robert Stadler, damn it. And by taking over by taking over Project X, he's going to be able to, rule by terror all the people within the radius of Project X, and then he'll be safe. And he thinks this is practical, but in some sense, he's drowning out what his actual motive is. And Ben, you were saying something about what the motive is he's drowning out or evading.
Right. So the beginning of the chapter, page 1126, bottom of the page, you get him reflecting on what his motive is. And the motive directing his hands and feet was 4 days behind him. It was the face of the man on the windowsill and the faces he had confronted when he had escaped from the room. So one point is interesting, again, the focus on Galt's face, since it's often his face that he's been remembering all this time. I think you've got the wrong camera on. Good. Where's my face? And you get more development through this scene of considering whether it's the Galt's face or the gangster's faces that are the more significant factor. He's kind of trying to convince himself that escaping from their threat to make him a hostage is the real reason that he's running to Iowa. And indeed, there is some kind of threat because he's the only one that Galt had asked for, and they think that he's the only one that he cares about. But at the same time, we notice on several occasions that nobody's actually pursuing Stadler to Iowa. And then when we get what it is he's trying to actually do there, I'll show them there's no other way to live on Earth. But is it really them who he wants to show anything to? Thompson or Ferris, or the people that he's worried about being threatened by? Well, a little bit later, we get that what's implicit in his mind is, I'll show him there is no other way to live on Earth. And recall, of course, that one of the issues that comes up in the scene between him and Galt is, again, this how do you deal with things when you have to deal with people? You can't deal with them by reason. There's no other practical way to live aside from using force against them. And this is, for him, going to be the ultimate demonstration of that if he can pull it off. So, I mean, I think that Alex is on to something when she says that this is an issue of self-esteem for Stadler. One of the things that we got toward the end of Galt's speech is that there's nobody has a choice about the need for self-esteem. And even when they've done things they're ashamed of, they find the need to rationalize their behavior, to say, no, I was really doing the right thing. And this is the last thing that he's got left going for him. I mean, he's kind of already suffered his spiritual death, but he's still alive and has to convince himself that he didn't commit spiritual suicide. So this is the way he's going to do it.
There's, people have talked to us about real life applications of these ideas, and maybe here's a place to comment on one that's relevant in one's personal life. While we're talking about this need for self-esteem and what Stadler does in the face of it and how it can lead to bad actions in certain situations, there's a really lovely article written by Gina Gorlin that was published in Psychology Today. I forget the name of the blog that came out a few weeks ago on some practical advice about how to deal with situations where there are thoughts that are scary to you, and if you're, because it's not, you got to be evil like Robert Stadler to have some things that are threats to your self-esteem or self-image. Everyone has little things that, if you do with them what Stadler did, would lead you to become a Stadler. And what does it look like to take the opposite tack? And what are some ways to reinforce those habits in yourself? And I think Gina's, Dr. Gorlin's piece was really good on this.
I'll put it in the comments.
Ben, can you put it in the comments? Yes. Do you have the link to it? So Gina, you might recognize, was in on a couple of the supplemental episodes we did, some down here and some up up in Cambridge. Let's move on to well, we asked a question about what the state of the country was, and what we can tell about from what happened at Project X before Stadler got there, what we can tell about that about the state of the country. And let's very briefly cover that material. And Ben, should I go through that while you put up the link, or have you already found the link and put it up?
I already put it up.
You put it up already.
And I can.
Yeah. So why don't you take us through that, and then we'll get to the issue of the relation between Stadler and Meigs, and then I want to go to the torture scene.
Yeah. So we asked about what the state of Project X reveals about the state of the country, basically, and had some feedback on that. Will and Jesse pointed out that the fact that there's now this gang in control led by Cuffy Meigs shows the government has basically lost control. The country's in a state of anarchy and mob rule. Schuyler describes it as the rule of brute force, and that's what Cuffy Meigs has symbolized for some time toward the end of the book. David, I thought, made a really interesting point about how the way that the Project X facility had been changing hands was in certain ways reminiscent of Ayn Rand's own experience during the Russian Civil War, where she saw St. Petersburg change hands from the Tsar to the Kerensky provisional government to the communists. And then again, the town in Crimea that she had escaped to went back and forth between the Reds and the Whites. And Alex, who's with you there in New York, pointed out the interesting tidbit about how the thugs who are guarding the facility are described as being equally likely to defy or obey any authority, depending on who is more brutal, which I think underscores Schuyler's point about how it really is the rule of brute force. And Alex also observes that this means that Stadler is now witnessing the world that he had helped create, that his idea is you can only deal with other people by force, not reason, and that's what he's getting. And so when he goes in saying, I'm the one who created this is my property, how can he expect this claim to be taken seriously when property right is something that is a sphere of protection for rational agents who work by voluntary persuasion? And of course, Cuffy Meigs laughs him off when he claims this property right. This is a thing of the past for him.
I think this point about equally likely to defy or obey any authority is really interesting and fascinating and strikingly, it's a very Ayn Rand perspective on a certain type of person. This is one of the passages I was hoping somebody would notice when we put up that question. It was the primary one. That the type of person who's obedient to an authority figure is also the kind of person who's likely to just blindly defy authority. We talked about this a little bit before in thinking about how to assess various political trends and so forth. I don't really want to pause more on it now, but just it's an interesting perspective. You don't hear it often, that there's a kind of fighty defiance and thoughtless obedience that come from the same root. And it's an idea to put in your hat and put under your hat, put in your pipe and smoke. An idea to kind of take in and think about. Al, did you want to comment?
She identified as counterfeit individualism?
Well, I think that's not necessarily the same phenomena. They're also phenomena that they're all often related. But let's move on to this issue of the relationship between Stadler and Meigs. Ben, do you want to take us through some of the comments on that, starting with Betsy's?
Betsy's was the first. So we asked how their outlooks were like and unalike. And Betsy said, both of them, Stadler and Meigs, are motivated by fear and a strong desire to rule and control people. Both act on their feelings impulsively without well thought out plans. And Carol, I thought, made an interesting point about the difference between the two of them, though there's a question of how big the difference is, though Meigs does what he does through drunken stupor, while Stadler does it through some sort of blind evasion. And Carol asks the question, which is a worse folly? And I would just observe that even though Stadler isn't technically drunk in this scene in the way that Meigs literally is, it's interesting to see how the author has described his state of mind. There's all this language about how his mind is liquid with terror. His thoughts are like chips floating in a liquid without connections. In the depth of his liquid brain, he senses he's terrified of something other than the Washington gang. And then you get an especially interesting touch where once he gets to Iowa and he's saying, I'll show him, This is described as a solid gold statement in the midst of a fiercely silent swamp. And fiercely silent is interestingly paradoxical language. So you've got swamp, which is connected to the liquid again, but the silence here seems to be enforced, which is probably suggesting how this is a kind of evasion, not just a drift that he's fallen into. So it's like having gotten drunk. It's just that it's not with chemical help. It's with a psychological habituation of a kind. Your mic is not on.
One of the things that's really interesting to me is that the way what happened is described is that somebody had the same view of existence as his, namely Stadler's, and so had the same plan and the same goal. And that turns out to be Coffee Meg's. So, they had the same goal. They both wanted to take over this facility and use it to rule a bit of the countryside like a feudal lord. How is it the same view of existence? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Well, in a sense, I mean, we're having a conversation about this. While they appear to be very radically different, one is the mind, one is the body, they're two sides of the same coin. They both think the mind is impractical in the world. So the only way you get stuff done is like forcing bodies around. So that's their view of existence, is you have to force physical things around because minds and bodies are not really related.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that they represent the two sides of the mind-body dichotomy.
And on that, also, Greg...
Go ahead, Ben. Sorry, I didn't hear the film.
Just real quick on that, it's interesting that Miggs uses practically the same language to make fun of Stadler. I'm tired with you impractical dreamers and intellectuals. The same thing that basically Stadler had said against Axton, complaining about impractical idealists when he was founding the State Science Institute.
Mohammed?
Yeah, as far as like fiefdoms go, the State Science Institute, at least as Stadler thought, it would be something like that for him. Like, it would be a place where you would just get a lot of money, extort a lot of money from a lot of people, and fund things that he cares, for. The fact that Coffee Meg doesn't really care about cosmic rays is the only difference.
You're the guy who catches atoms or something.
Yeah, right.
Other spaces.
But it's the same, just the same way of living.
Yeah. Francisco calls him the looter who thinks his ends justify the seizures of my means. Now, at least he's interested in justification, or at least, whereas Miggs isn't, right? He doesn't claim he's justified, or he's just not interested in issues of justification.
Aspiring ends that are...
But what they have in common is, I think Carrie Ann said it really well, that this, they don't think ideas matter in reality. They think it's a reality in which you have to deal with things by force. It's a reality in which the mind doesn't belong. And so Stadler sees himself as representing the mind and fears he doesn't belong in it, and has to deal with people by force and has to get force wielders to somehow do his bidding. And Miggs thinks, well, I'm the force wielder. They're also each dominated by fear, and they're each dominated by fear in their encounter with one another. Right? And what is it that they each fear? And Alex, you had said something on this online. Should I read what you said, or do you want to say something about it now in person?
You can read it, and I'll see if I have
if you have anything to add. Okay, so what you said online, I don't know if this is a quote or a paraphrase, because Ben puts these in, and sometimes they're each. While Stadler has pretenses about why he should be in control, Miggs has none. So that's the point that we were just making, Mohammed. But then Stadler is terrified Miggs is his spiritual son, while Miggs is terrified of a non-obedient intellectual. Both want to be tyrants. That was a paraphrase. Ben says that was a paraphrase. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that, or Alex in particular?
Well, I wanted to add, so Coffee Meg's, he knows what he is. He knows he's a thug and he wants to go out and hurt people. He's not illusioning himself about it. He's making bribes for land. He's demanding land from people. Meanwhile, Stadler, he's justifying it to himself as in, I'm the scientist, I should be in control of this nuclear reactor. but Coffee Megs doesn't care about that. He doesn't see the scientific aspect of it as relevant.
Yeah, well, there's something else interesting here, because you say Meggs wants to hurt people, but in a sense he doesn't, right? That is, Meggs isn't driven especially, or at least not as obviously, to destroy. He's driven to steal, and then he'll destroy whoever he needs to do it. In the case of Stadler, he has what seems to be a more noble goal, science, but he actually is driven by, he wants to kill Galt. And he doesn't want to kill Galt for some, I'll get a lot of money if I kill him, or some, and beyond that, he thinks Galt just has to be destroyed. So at this point, he's driven by this maniacal, destructive hatred. Al?
Yeah, I wonder if also there's a convergence here between the intrinsic theory of value represented by Stadler and the subjective theory of value represented by Meggs. They're both rejecting an objective theory of value. Meggs is, I want what I want when I want it, and Stadler is, science is good. It's just good, and I just know that it is.
Al Online says that they're afraid of each other. Meggs is afraid of a superior intellect, and Stadler of mindless brutes. I think there's something right about that, but I think it's bigger in both cases than that. So as Ben, as you pointed out, it's not just, or maybe someone online had pointed out and you were reading, I forget, it's not just that Stadler is afraid of mindless brutes, but he's afraid of the fact that he has sold out the world to mindless brutes, and they're his spiritual sons. And Meggs's terror is wider. His terror is of the whole of existence. It encompasses the whole of existence. And that at the moment of his triumph, this mysterious occult breed, the intellectual, turns up and isn't cowed by his authority, or isn't responding to his authority. Damn it, I should be able to do whatever I want. I've taken over. You shouldn't be able to tell me or constrain me. There shouldn't be any rules or things that hem me in, or experts or authorities or anything. I should just, damn it, I should be able to do what I want. I shouldn't have to answer to anything or be controlled by anything. And there's this kind of guy who represents reality, and seeing things that might control you, or might, make your whims not omnipotent. And he's afraid that that guy shows up now when he thinks it should be his moment of triumph and ultimate power, and that guy's not obeying him. Mohammed?
As if Robert Stadler is the independent-minded type. But one larger thing is there's this whole talk of like a degeneration between in the beginning you'd get Wesley Mouch and however low they were not the gangs that show up at the end of the novel, trashing Reardon's factory and blowing up 10-mile radius, and it's interesting to see that one line of that degeneracy is Stadler and his son Cuffy Meggs, and that's kind of like an example of how you'd go from something that is bad but can be ostensibly look like it's not that bad, like is a scientific mind, and then you end up with a thug at the end of the line. That's one example.
We're having online Harry Mullen, or Harry, I'm not supposed to say last names, is saying that I do what I want and so forth. Reminds him of a certain Penn Avenue resident. I've mentioned he's not the first to make that particular comparison. Cargate did in an article, and I have in some others. And I think it's just on this point that there is a comparison of mentalities there. Any other points on, there was one other thing that was said online. Yeah, there's both, Harry's also saying they take what they want, the goods are just there, and this is the same point that Francisco had made. His ends justify the seizure of my means. Well, let's get back into the story and just point out what the results of this melee are, and then move on to the torture scene, which is, I think, where we want to end today. Ben, any last thoughts on that, the results of the melee, or other thoughts you want to?
Well, yeah, the result, of course, is death and destruction, and the collapse of the Taggart Bridge, because the Project X machine goes belly up and takes out a swath of territory in the radius of its power, some number of hundreds of miles. and Project X is right at the edge of this radius. And I think you pointed out to me at one time in the past, I can't remember when, that it's significant that in this scene it's described that it's only the western span of the bridge that collapses. And if you recall, at one point when Project X is unveiled at first, whoever's giving the speech, I think it was Floyd Ferris, says if we had been able to obtain more Reardon metal, we could have widened the radius. And so, of course, the reason they couldn't is because Reardon refused to sell it to them. So unlike Stadler, who has lent his mind to the creation of weapons of death, Reardon refused to, and as a result, saved lots of lives. I mean, not only the other half of the bridge would have collapsed were it not for Reardon, but a much larger part of the country. Who knows if it might have gone all the way to New York or something, or to the Valley.
At one point I had that thought, did Reardon save the Valley or save any of the other characters? And you and I trying to check the geography of how much wider it would have been given what Ferris said, and we I think concluded the Valley would have still been safe and the cities would have been.
I think we did. Yeah, that's right. But Chicago would have been gone. So that's no small thing.
Yeah, just the final sentence in this. Stadler doesn't die right away. He hangs on for a couple of more minutes. And this reminds me, I think Ayn Rand has written about this at the end of Notre Dame. Quasimodo has Claude Frollo, and he doesn't kill him right away. He actually learns the nature of the evil he did before he ends up dying. And that scene kind of reminded me of that a little bit.
Yeah.
It wasn't immediate death. This
last point is a anticlimax to, Robert, your point, which is, I think, much more significant. But I think now the reason why it's set up in the book so that it ends at the end of that the bridge is at the periphery of it is if the bridge was in the middle of the Project X realm, they would have no way of knowing what happened to the bridge. And New York would have just lost contact with the bridge. It wouldn't have known it was out. But since the bridge breaks in half, it's on the periphery of the circle, and so word's able to get back to New York that the bridge has collapsed. And they don't know why, but they can only speculate that it's Project X because they can't get in touch with anything in the middle of it. So I'm guessing that's why it happened. It's also a bit of a Chekhov's gun when it's announced earlier, to roughly where the Taggart Bridge is. That's where this reign of destruction ends, if people know that idea of Chekhov's gun. Al saying part of the bridge was reinforced with weird metal. That is the bridge of the Atlantic Southern, I think you're thinking of, Al, if I'm not mistaken. But the bridge here, the issue is just that it's within the range of this weapon, whereas it just happens to be that the bridge is about where the end of the range is, and that's why more wasn't destroyed. All right, so let's move on to the torture scene. And we had some questions about this. Will and we'd asked in particular about the motivations of the torturers and similarities and differences among them. And Will and Schuyler, I think Schuyler in particular, gave us a kind of breakdown of them. I think Will's perspective on it was a little different than Schuyler's. And Will, you can tell us. Mouch wants to persuade Galt, says Schuyler. Ferris wants to test his machine and sadistically control Galt, but test his machine, I think, was how Schuyler had put it. And Jim is a killer. And
I agree with all three of those.
You agree with all three of those. Do you think it's test the machine? Because I thought that was more Schuyler's perspective, and the sadism was more yours.
Well, it's more like he wants to show off how perfectly it works.
Okay, so he wants to show off his machine.
He says, we got confessions in 3 murder cases. Yeah. He doesn't say anything about whether those confessions turn out to be true.
Right. World. Yeah, there were 3 unsolved murders cases. I had that thought too. Yeah, so I agree with what was said about Jim, that we see that he's a killer, and Paul adds he wants to see Galt tortured to death with his extreme hatred, and more on this in a moment.
More people on the group pointed out that, remember, Ferris is the biologist who studied animal fear. And this is actually pretty much the point of the Ferris persuader, not to kill someone, but to make him think it's going to kill him.
Yeah, Paul on the group called him some kind of twisted B.F. Skinner.
Who was pretty twisted to begin with.
Yes, who was pretty twisted to begin with. And I definitely think he's a Skinner type. I can't imagine that Rand didn't have Skinner in mind. She did write about Skinner later in her life. I don't think she wrote about it. I expect she would have known about him earlier because he was famous, but the stuff about him that she wrote about was stuff that he did later. And he has this notion that he can make, anyway, more on Ferris in a moment. Then there's this other character, people like Mouch, and I think we can put Thompson in this category. These are reluctant torturers. So Jim and Ferris are both keen to use this machine for one reason or another. Ferris, this sadism, maybe wanting to show off the machine, maybe some other things that we'll see. Jim out of just hatred for Galt. Thompson and Mouch and the others are a little bit different, right? Tinky Holloway runs off. He doesn't want to be involved with this. Thompson says, oh, do what you want. So he'll let them do it, but he's not going to own that that's the decision he's making. And he's kind of giving in and abdicating authority. Mouch, Paul describes him as a master of evasion, and I think that's what's going on now. He has to save us, says Mouch slowly, as if straining the last of his mind into blankness, right? And Ferris responds, well, why don't you write him a love letter about it, right? So Mouch isn't keen to torture him, but it's an absolute that he has to be made to help us. And so he will stick to that point in his mind and blank out what the means to that are, though they're not means he wants to acknowledge to himself, whereas the other two, Ferris and Taggart, are cool with the means. Other thoughts on this, on these three motives? And let's stick to before they actually get to the torture chamber for a moment. Yeah.
Well, I actually had a question. I wondered why Lawson wasn't in the room, because he was part of the Ferris Meigs faction that is pure brute force. And I know Ferris tells him to go on radio and tell him we'll have him in 3 hours, but I thought he would want to see that torture as well, since that was part of his...
I mean, my sense is, so it's the Ferris, Meigs, Lawson axis. So interesting that Meigs has already, he's left that axis. They don't get anywhere bargaining with radio ghosts and so forth. I take it that the concrete reason in the novel is that Lawson has to be operating the radio things and whatever, and the other reason, so that's within the world of the novel, I would take that to be the reason he has other work to do. I think the literary reason, from the author's perspective of why this should happen, is she gets a representative of each type in the room this way. She could have had Thompson there, but Mouch he's the one who's a liberal man, like Mr. Thompson. And I think Ferris, Taggart, and Thompson and Mouch represent different types. We should connect this, what we've said about their decisions and the differences between their motives, to what Dagny realizes about them that we've already said. We've already quoted that paragraph about Dagny's realization, which is meant to apply to all of the three. And let me just read some lines from this paragraph I quoted before about this. Moved by the panic of their nameless emotions. All right, so that's what they didn't think this would work. They didn't think anything they could save them now. They didn't even really want to be saved. So even Mouch, who is doing it, or who puts up the best pretense to himself that what he wants is the practical consequence of this, Dagny thinks he and none of the others really want to be saved. Rather, they're moved by the panic of nameless emotions. And skipping a bit, at last they felt at home. They didn't have to know why they felt it. They who had never chosen to know what they felt. They merely experienced a sense of recognition. Since this was what they had been seeking, this was the kind of reality that had been implied in all of their feelings, their actions, their desires, their choices, their dreams. So the idea isn't that they hold as some articulate philosophical theory or some deliberate, this is what reality should be like. And think again about the narrator saying someone had the same view of reality as Stadler, and that turns out to be Miggs. It's not that they have an articulate theory they could write a book about. Here's my view of reality. It's a fluid thing to be bent to my whims. But rather, that premise about reality is something that's held in the form of certain emotions and choices. It's implied in the way that you choose to face the world. And the kind of philosophical theory that the world is to be shaped by my desires is the premise that you're on if you're acting that way. But it's a kind of articulation of how the world would have to be for that kind of policy to make sense. And so what you're in effect affirming about the world when you're acting that way. I've mentioned before these series of psychology notes that Rand wrote in the late 50s while writing Galt's speech. And you can find some of them, not all of them have been published, but the published ones you can find in the Journals of Ayn Rand, edited by David Harriman. And one of the things she talks about is the way in which people hold basic premises. And it's not in terms, as she thinks then, of articulate thoughts, but of kind of policies of action that have been automatized that would, if expressed as thoughts like, why are you acting this way, would amount to statements like this. And I think that's what's going on with these characters here. And they feel a sense of recognition. This feels right. This makes sense. Again, she compares some of them to cheats who realize that the game is up and knew it could end no other way. And there's a kind of comfort in that, in knowing that it's ending this way. It's not that they really articulately know it could end no other way, but there's some kind of resolve like, yeah, what are you going to do? That's sort of, you've been acting on this kind of premise. And I think that's what we're seeing going on in this scene. Ben, shall we move on? Is there anything else we should say about the decision to torture him before they get to the torture chamber? I can't hear you, Ben.
Go ahead.
Okay, so then let's move to the issue of how Galt bears the torture. And Ben, I think we had some comments on this.
Yeah, I thought JG made an interesting comment that I'll just read it. Galt's resistance wasn't the surrender to impulse, but a calm and controlled surrender, knowing that truth and reality are on his side. His strike was predicated on not exerting effort that will go to waste. And I think you wanted to compare that to something he says to Dagny later.
Well, yeah, just the idea of, I'm not sure how this, I don't think this is in conflict with JG's comment, but I think, well, the thing that stands out to me about the torture, and maybe this is part of what JG is picking up on, is Galt doesn't fight it. He just surrenders to it and then remains himself in the moments between the electric shocks. And this reminds me of the passage, what he says to Daphne, don't think of them now, never think of pain or danger or enemies a moment longer than is necessary to fight them. Mohammed?
Yeah, I have a comment about a symbolism and an illusion. So the symbolism of them holding down a person who's representative of the strike, of the productive person, and torturing him is obviously like just a concrete picture of this the whole novel, just what the world that was built was. Second was the allusion maybe to the Stoic idea of you could be like on a rack tortured, and you that type of allusion. Do you think that's intentional, or is it just something that you could just notice and not have?
I don't think so. There's this Stoic idea that the wise person is happy on the rack.
I don't think he's happy.
Aristotle rejects, doesn't he?
Yeah, so what happened is, there's this idea going on in Greek philosophy that virtue should be good for you and should insulate you from negative effects of bad luck insofar as is possible. And in Aristotle's view, which I agree with and think Rand and Galt would, is that, well, that's true. Virtue is good for you, and it doesn't, however, make you impervious to luck, but it makes you in the best situation you can be, whatever happens to you. And it makes it such that your life isn't utterly ruined by some bad thing happening to you. And so Galt is able to still be Galt on the rack, and Galt's life isn't destroyed by his being on the rack, even were he to have died there. But he's not happy on the rack. And the Stoic view, and this is also the Epicurean idea, is that the virtue should make you totally impervious to what happens in life, such that, being on the rack, it doesn't matter where you are, it's all the same, because all that matters is your internal processes. And I think that's a view that Rand would reject emphatically.
So is it at least like an illusion to reject that idea?
I think the idea, if you're a literary author and you're talking about somebody who's an idealist, you want to imagine him in the worst kind of situations, and torture obviously presents itself, right? And if you think it's not just the Stoics, Jesus is tortured on a cross. A lot of traditions that have an ideal man, hero figure, and I think we'll talk more about these in other connections, goes through some kind of torture, and it's just, I think, a natural mythic or literary device, and I think that's why the Stoics deal with it, but also why Rand, that I don't think, she may well have known about the Stoics writing about that, but I don't know of any particular reason to think she did, and even if she did, I think there's a more general reason for this being here. There's also torture in her other novels. There's torture in Anthem. It's just, if you're thinking about an idealist and what he's willing to go through for his ideals and how he deals with them and how ideals arm you to deal with different situations, then it's just a natural thing to have a torture scene, I think. Let's talk about how the Watchers behave during the torture. And I think here again we see the difference between the three of them, between Mouch, Ferris, and Jim. Mouch is always afraid, right? We have to be careful. Isn't that enough? He'll consent now. You don't want to kill him. Remember, if he dies, we die, and so forth, right? So Mouch is the anti-torture voice, or the reining in the torture voice, anyway, who doesn't seem to want Galt to die. What about Ferris? What's going on with Ferris in this scene? Yeah, Alex.
Ferris becomes almost mechanical about the manner in which he tortures Galt. After the electric pulses start, it says that Ferris's eyes were blank, Mouch is terrified, Taggart's disappointed. And when Ferris starts off, it almost reads as if it was a villain from some kind of movie or something, where he goes, "I'll give you 30 seconds, and if not, then..."
It's a little Bond villainy, yeah.
Yeah.
There's also, though, his eyes are blank in that moment. I think that's true, but I think there's a kind of lust in Ferris here. Mouch says, well, he'll give in now or whatever. No, that's not enough. I want him to want to follow us. I want him to want to believe. This is what Ferris is all about. This is what Ferris is, a power luster. We were after power. You guys were pikers, right? He says to Reardon. This is what Ferris has always wanted to do, to exert power over people. Yeah, Paul?
It's the same thing in this phrase where he says, I understand that you're some sort of an electrical expert. So are we, don't you think? He's strapped to the table like, we're better than you. Look who's on the table now.
Yeah, he's a real mustache-tooling kind of villain in a sense. Alex?
I was just looking at that same quote. So when Ferris tortures Galt, he's not doing it in a way where he gets very emotional, he's not acting angry, he's really cool and calculated, and he's saying all these clever phrases.
Right.
And it's a very natural mode of being for him.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So it's not that he's unemotional, it's that this is what life's about for him. And so he's undisturbed, he's untroubled by it. He's at home, maybe for the first time. And also that language of, I want him to believe, we're going to make him believe. Does that put you guys in mind of anything? Or Ben, do you have any thoughts? 1984
Yeah,
is what it
me.
puts me in mind of Will.
They did it until he actually loved Big Brother.
Yeah.
And 2 and 2 made 5.
And 2 and 2 made 5. And people have
two
compared
equals.
Rand's work to Orwell's on a lot of counts, including, Ben, you made this point earlier, which that he thinks the state can get this kind of control and still be powerful, whereas Rand thinks it won't and it'll wither. Shoshana Milgram has pointed out that there's a way in which you might think that's unfair, in that you do see signs in 1984 that the Visi screens are breaking and things are starting to break down a bit. But I think at a deeper level, the point you're making is, and that others have made, is really right, that Orwell thinks this works, where Rand doesn't. In 1984 is a world of deterministic beings, where Big Brother is able to predict everything that's happening in the party is able to predict the whole course of the hero's journey. He's able to reprogram him. It turns out they're doing this all the time, and people. So it's a deterministic nightmare world where a Ferris kind of person can be successful at this. And Ayn Rand's
Greg,
view
it's
is
significant.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
It's significant that Ferris doesn't just want to be able to force Galt to do something deterministically. He wants to be able to force his mind. He wants to make him believe and to accept and to work for the state voluntarily, which is what a determinist would have to think, that it wouldn't make a difference whether you're made to think something by the evidence versus by a shock treatment. But of course, it doesn't work. And it's a big theme of Galt's speech that you can't force a mind. And that's, bound up with her view of free will and volition as the choice to think or not to think. And that's where our basic locus of agency is.
Yeah. And what about Jim? What's Jim's role in this scene? Again, early on, we see Jim's breakdown later, but what's Jim's role in this little society of three watchers?
No, I want to talk about the breakdown. That's what I want to talk about.
I mean, Ben, as you put it when we were talking before, Jim's egging Ferris on, right? He hasn't even screamed yet. Can't we use higher voltage?
Says that twice.
So, yeah. So Jim's motivation, he just wants to hurt Galt. Ferris wants to exert power. Jim just wants to hurt Galt. And Mouch wants somehow for the system to work. And I guess this is the way, but don't kill him. All right. So the generator breaks. We had
Greg,
some comments about this.
Before we get to that, I just want to flag a few interesting comments in the chat. One is from Harry, who points out that Prometheus, of course, is a notable character who's tortured in mythology, and there's a allusion, a connection between Galt and Prometheus, who changed his mind earlier in the book. So that's something. And then I think it's Dale who pointed out that Rand had a favorite painting by Salvador Dali, Corpus Hypercubus, which is a kind of modernized image of Christ on a cross, which I vaguely remember hearing someone in the objectivist oral tradition say was part of the reason that she liked it was because it was associated with the image of Galt. I can put a link to that in the comments as well.
A favorite painting of mine also, it's Dali's Crucifixion, yeah. And the way I've heard this bit of lore, at one of the sub Q&A after a lecture of Marianne Suri's maybe on painting, she said that if you turned it on its side, it's what she pictured Galt on the torture apparatus looking at. Iris and Al, you might have been there with this or know this more. Do you recall what was said about that?
Did hear it, yeah.
Were you at that meeting, or you just also heard other people say it?
No, heard it.
You've heard it from him.
And he was described as looking like a Greek statue, right?
But stylized to the lines of an airplane mechanic, yeah. And it's a beautiful painting. Good, thank you for putting the link. Right. Yeah, that's right. It's at the Met. It's in New York. Ben, you want to take us through some of the comments about the broken generator passage?
Yeah, some really interesting points. One from Skylar, who says, I love Galt's reaction to the failure of the generator. He's saying, is that all you've got? Here, I can help you with my own torture, you brutes. That's how confident and relaxed I am about this whole corrupt turn of events. I like that. And Laura follows up and says, in essence, he was torturing his torturers, saying, you can't even torture me without my help. You still need my mind. And I think it's a really nice touch that for a very brief moment, the torturers and possibly the reader are led to believe that Galt is resurrected from the dead when they hear his heart stop beating and then he suddenly awakens. And of course, they quickly realized it's because the generator had died, and so the speaker connected to his heart is turned off. And this has always struck, since we were talking about Dali's crucifixion painting, this has always struck me as a mild send-up of Christian resurrection mythology, because of course
only the true carpenter is needed to really nail someone to a cross.
This one is listed in TV tropes as the breaking speech or the Hannibal lecture.
Hannibal lecture, that's pretty good. Do people know about TV tropes? We'll just mention it's a website where they name recurrent kinds of tropes in different television shows and also in literature. And you can find a trope. They usually have clever names, and then it'll list,
Time sink.
It'll list a million different, programs, novels, movies where you can find it. Okay, so the significance, I think these people captured well, the significance of the generator breaking down. They can't even torture Galt. They're so inept. And, of course, Galt taunts them with that by telling them how to fix it. And the technician who's there, realizes what's going on, and he runs out of the room, right? What about Jim Taggart? So the technician runs out. Jim Taggart thinks, I'll do it myself then. Galt's told them how to fix the generator. What about Jim's reaction to this? Ben, you want to take us through the comments online, and then we'll go to New York for comments on it?
Yeah, Jim, so Greg P. pointed out Jim can't face Galt, realizing how alive Galt is and how Jim's life has been a lie, so he wants Galt tortured. Jesse makes a similar point that Jim can't evade any longer, that Galt's death seems more valuable to him than his own, so he's realizing in this moment that he's basically a nihilist, not unlike Lillian, and what leads to her demise. Skylar and Laura make the point that this must be what amounts to Jim's spiritual death if we saw both Lillian's and Stadler's portrayed earlier. And on that point, I want to point out another.
Ben seems to have frozen. Well, if I'm not mistaken, Ben was going to...
It's the same
Ben,
point
you're
that
back.
Alex...
Sorry. Ben, you froze for just a moment. So do you want to repeat your point about the connection to Stadler?
Yeah, page 1145, we're given a brief introspective moment of Jim's, and we're learning more about his motivation in this point leading up to the breakdown. And it connects to the point that Alex was making again about self-esteem. It was not his incommunicable soul or his love for others or his social duty or any of the fraudulent sounds by which he had maintained his self-esteem. It was the lust to destroy whatever was living for the sake of whatever was not. It was the urge to defy reality by the destruction of every living value. And here's, I think, the really important point. For the sake of proving to himself that he could exist in defiance of reality and would never have to be bound by any solid, immutable facts. I mean, I think that a lot of that same motivation is at work in Stadler's attitude as well, and to one extent or another in the other torturers. And this is part of why it is that they want Galt to die, because they think that by killing him they demonstrate their power over him, and therefore by transitivity over reality, because Galt is so focused on reality. If they can beat him, they don't need reality.
But there are versions of it. So in some people's version, it's focused on the power, but in both Stadler in his final variant, once he's totally destroyed himself version, and in Jim, it's not even focused on having him under their power. It's on destroying the person whose existence is a reproach to them. Other thoughts from New York on Jim's breakdown? I have a few to add, but Iris?
In italic, we have the word greatness, Galt's greatness, that he wants to destroy. And that's what he had with Cheryl. He was using Cheryl to destroy his sister.
And Reardon, yeah.
The greatness of his sister. I just want to go back.
Let me say one thing about the greatness, though, before that. It was greatness by the only standard there is, right? And that standard was mastering reality. So that's significant, that there's only one objective standard of value, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. It's your relationship to reality, and Galt excels at that, and that's why he hates Galt more than anyone. Go on, Iris, what do you want to take us back to?
When the technician runs out, Galt bursts out laughing. I mean, he is so alive and real in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Other thoughts from the room on Galt and Jim's breakdown?
He's realized that everything Cheryl said was true.
Yeah.
You're a killer for the sake of killing.
Yeah, and there are a few aspects to that that I think are significant. One is he's seeing what it was that he wanted to destroy about Cheryl, right? Her face occurs to him. And she represented this love of life and this wanting to excel in reality, and that's why he wanted to destroy her. He always wanted to destroy that. But also what he's realizing about himself is, as you say, Will, that he's a killer to the sake of killing, a kind of person who's an enemy to everyone, and therefore an enemy to himself, and that's what his self-esteem can't take. Other thoughts or observations about this?
Yeah, and Galt knows it, and then he tells him, I told you that on the radio, didn't I? And that goes to the whole question of, well, you know the mystics are bad, sure, but with their teachers, what are their motive? And sometimes we forget that, but this is a demonstration of it.
Yeah, so that Galt told him that on the radio is significant, and that's significant to Taggart's undoing. That was the mark of objectivity, right? Without that, maybe he could have recovered or found some way to fake it further to himself. But that Galt was seeing the same thing he was seeing in that moment and named it and said, this is what I told you before, was a final thing for him. Another thing, part of what's really significant about this moment is that what he's realizing about himself is that his emotions had chosen this, right? So there's a lot of talk about, what's the role of emotions, and are there good and evil emotions, and is it only what's in your choice in the moment that makes you a good or bad person, or so forth. And but there are a lot of difficult philosophical questions you can think through about that. But what's happening with Jim in this moment is not that he's doing something evil in this moment. He's having a certain emotional response in this moment, which is the emotional response of lusting to kill Galt, knowing that that will kill himself, and lusting to kill Galt for a certain reason, which he identifies, and recognizing that fact about himself, that his emotions, maybe because he's made himself this way, but nonetheless, that in this moment, this is what his emotions lead him to, that makes him realize what he is. And what he is the kind of person who feels this way and acts this way. And that is what is this mark of damnation on him. And what is it that he is? What is it that his emotions want? He wanted, the way it's put is, he wanted to destroy reality in the person of Galt. So it's not just that he wants to kill Galt because he hates him so much. He hates existence, and Galt represents existence. Galt is great by the standard of the only code that there is, the only set of standards that are genuine, which is the standard of being able to live in existence, in reality, the reality of which Galt is the realm. Galt is a master of reality, and reality is the realm of which Galt is so radiant a sun. S-O-N. Some editions of the mass market paperback say S-U-N, but it's important that it's S-O-N. He's a radiant son of reality. He's not like he created, and he wants to kill him. He wants to destroy him, and he wants to destroy. He wants there not to be an existence, which means he wants not to live. He resents reality, and that's the kind of core of Jim. And I think we're going to have to talk. And it's Rand's view of what the core of evil is, and of complete evil. So that's where the chapter ends, right? Mouch and Ferris leave before what happens to him happens to them. Everyone thinks is dead, in effect, whether he continues to move or walk. What was driving him is gone, and he's like a husk now, as we think Lillian is. Any last thoughts?
Well, Al in the chat reminds us of the last line of the chapter. Only, Al, it's not a battery, it's a generator, right? For the moment, their only certainty was that they had to escape from that cellar, the cellar where the living generator was left tied by the side of the dead one. And it's important that it's a generator and not a battery, right? Because it's not just that Galt has a certain stored amount of energy that will exhaust itself. It's that he's a dynamic, ongoing, actively sustained source of life and power, and that's why his mind can't just be forced, and why he survives.
And that's why the chapter is called The Generator. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you guys next week at our same Atlas time and same Atlas channel for the final chapter of the novel. And then again, the Sunday following that for a capstone event where we're going to just talk through some major themes of the novel and this issue of love of life versus the kind of motivation that Jim has is certainly going to be among them. All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.